Before this story continues, please allow me to clarify one important thing. The story you are about to hear is a work of fiction created for educational and entertainment purposes, centered on toxic family dynamics and the emotional weight they leave behind set within the world of U.S. military life and military families. All characters, ranks, units, locations, events, and circumstances are entirely fictional and do not represent, reflect, or reference any real individuals, military units, or organizations within the U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, or Coast Guard. This content does not depict real events, disclose military information, or promote violence, hatred, or harm of any kind. The message is told with respect for the core values of the United States military, including honor, discipline, accountability, and human dignity. Portions of this story may be supported by AI tools during the creative process. This content is advertiser-friendly, aligned with YouTube community policies, and is not intended to distort or misrepresent the image of American service members or institutions. Now that you understand this story is fictional, we can begin. And remember this. In this story, justice comes from the system, not from shouting. My name is Nix. I am 27 years old, and on Christmas Eve in Fayetteville, North Carolina, I was legally on leave sitting at my stepfather's dining table when the sound of metal clicking shut changed everything. The house smelled like gravy and roasted turkey, the kind that clings to curtains. Soft Christmas music hummed from a speaker in the corner. Yellow lights wrapped the window frames, blinking lazily. I had just placed my napkin on my lap when I heard the unmistakable snap of a restraint locking closed. For a moment, no one spoke. My stepfather, Mark Harlan, stood at the head of the table, tapping his glass with a spoon the way he always did when he wanted control of the room. He did not raise his voice. He never did. He preferred something worse. He smiled politely and said, almost cheerfully, "Let's keep this calm." Paige, my stepsister, tilted her phone slightly upward, already recording her lips curved in a soft, practiced smile that said she had been waiting for this. My mother, Elaine, stared down at her plate. Grandma Ruth's hands began to shake. Mark cleared his throat and spoke as if delivering a family briefing. "This is just a procedure," he said. "We will do this with respect." Two men stepped forward from the doorway. Not local police in flashing lights, but a base security liaison Mark had called under false pretenses. They avoided eye contact with me. Cold metal tightened around my wrists. Mark looked at me and said, "You are quiet because you are guilty. The house does not host strangers wearing honor like a jacket." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain who I was or where I served. I sat there cuffed at the table while Mark gestured for everyone else to continue eating. "Go on," he said, "let dinner get cold." Paige leaned closer and whispered just loud enough for me to hear smile, "This is going viral." My mother did not stop him. Silence sat heavier than the cuffs. Grandma Ruth tried to speak, then stopped. Mark watched me carefully, waiting for me to react, to beg to break, but I did not. Inside, something folded in on itself, not fear, not anger, something quieter and sharper. I thought about exits without looking at them. I noticed where the doors were, where the hallway narrowed, how long it had been since my phone buzzed. I kept my breathing even. Mark leaned closer and said, "If you are so important, say it out loud. Tell them who you think you are." I met his eyes and said one sentence, steady and low. "You wanted authority. You can have it. But real authority does not live in raised voices. It lives in the right channel." That was when Mark laughed and told everyone to keep eating. That was when Paige adjusted her phone again. That was when I understood how badly he wanted an audience. I did not know yet how close he was to losing everything he used to feel powerful. If you have ever been humiliated by family at a dinner table, comment one word: "scene." The cuffs were still cold against my wrists when my mind drifted backward, not in panic but in pattern recognition, because this moment had not come from nowhere. It had been rehearsed for years in smaller humiliations, quieter exclusions, things that never made noise but left marks just the same. Paige had always been the one chosen first. When she turned 18, Mark announced at the dinner table that her college was covered, tuition paid in advance, housing, secured insurance bundled under his name, so she would never have to worry. A year later, when she needed a car, he surprised her with keys slid across the counter like a reward. He called it investing in potential. When I brought up graduate programs tied to my service obligations, Mark smiled thinly and said, "Discipline builds character, not handouts." Paige was supported. I was expected to be grateful for restraint. Mark loved the word respect, used it the way other people use duct tape to bind conversations shut. Respect meant do not question. Respect meant comply. Respect meant knowing your place in his house even when I no longer lived there. Elaine watched all of it unfold the same way she always did, hands folded, eyes lowered, convincing herself that staying quiet kept the peace. It did not. It just taught Mark that silence was consent. There were small things that built over time. One summer, I noticed I had stopped seeing messages from the family group chat. I asked Elaine about it gently, and she told me Mark thought I was too sensitive for group discussions. From then on, they only called when something was needed. Paige needed help moving. Mark needed paperwork translated. Elaine needed me to smooth something over. Paige learned quickly how to turn politeness into a blade. She once posted a photo online after a holiday dinner, everyone smiling except me, cropped out, captioned with a line that stung because it sounded casual. "Some people cosplay service." I did not respond. Grandma Ruth texted me that night, fingers shaky on the screen. "Do not react. The more you react, the more they win." I kept that message saved. I sent Christmas gifts anyway every year because I believed effort mattered even when it went unreturned. One year, I mailed a handmade blanket to Elaine and a set of books Mark once said he loved. When they arrived, Mark laughed and said, "Money like that buys appearances, not loyalty." What kind of money is it anyway? Dirty money cannot buy respect. Elaine was there. She heard it. She said nothing. That was the moment something shifted in me. I understood then that her silence was not neutral. It was a decision. Mark spoke often about discipline and order, but it was never about values. It was about control. He liked knowing who would flinch. He liked knowing who would stay. Paige learned how to perform for him, how to nod at the right times, how to agree loudly. I learned how to endure quietly. Even now at the table, I noticed how Mark kept glancing at the door, checking that the scene was unfolding the way he wanted. I noticed Paige adjusting her phone angle. I noticed Elaine staring at the place where the table met the floor, as if she could disappear into it. When the liaison tightened the cuffs, my first instinct was not fear. It was assessment. Who authorized this? Where was it logged? What jurisdiction was being claimed? I did not ask out loud. I did not need to. Mark was enjoying the show too much to notice the flaws. I thought of all the times he had told me I was difficult for asking questions. All the times he had framed my restraint as guilt. All the times Elaine had chosen quiet over truth. Grandma Ruth looked at me, eyes wet, apologetic. I gave her a small nod to tell her I understood. Mark cleared his throat again and reminded everyone to keep eating. Paige smiled wider, whispering that this would teach me humility. Inside the weight of it pressed down not just the cuffs but the history, the long pattern of being minimized, sidelined, framed as ungrateful for refusing to perform submission. I did not need to shout to know what was happening. I recognized it the same way I recognized bad procedures and weak chains of command. This was not discipline. It was theater. Elaine finally looked up, met my eyes for half a second, then looked away again. That hurt more than anything Mark said. If you have ever watched someone you love stay silent while you were treated unfairly, comment silence. The truth was that nothing about my path had been fast because I was fearless or gifted in the way people imagine when they want a simple explanation. It was fast because I learned early how systems fail under pressure and how to steady them without needing applause. I was never the loud one in a room. I listened, mapped risks, watched where information bottlenecked, and where decisions stacked on top of assumptions that had not been checked. Risk management was not theory to me. It was pattern recognition built from long hours watching small errors compound. Deconfliction was not a buzzword. It was the quiet work of aligning people who did not know they were about to collide. Logistics under pressure was where I lived most comfortably, not because it was dramatic, but because it punished ego and rewarded clarity. There was a mission early on that most people only knew as a near miss. I knew it as a chain of decisions drifting just far enough off alignment to become dangerous. Timelines slipped, authorities overlapped. A routine movement became ambiguous. I did not charge in. I traced the decision tree identified where confirmation bias had replaced verification, and flagged the point where two commands believed the other had ownership. I reported once clearly with evidence attached, then executed the correction I was authorized to make. It stopped the drift. Later, someone told me quietly that few people would have noticed until it was too late. I did not celebrate. I documented and moved on. After that, my file changed in ways I did not announce. Certain details were no longer accessible at the usual levels. Routing tags shifted. Handling became restricted without ceremony. It was not a promotion in the cinematic sense. It was responsibility accumulating. The call sign appeared the same way everything else had, not as a nickname passed around for style, but as a protocol spoken once over radio during a briefing when priority handling needed to be unambiguous. Black Angel was not praise. It was instruction. When it was used, channels cleared and assumptions stopped. I heard it once and did not react. I knew what it meant to those who understood systems. It meant do not improvise. It meant follow procedure exactly. I learned to work with people far above my pay grade by keeping my language precise and my requests minimal. I did not ask. I reported and executed. There was a rhythm to it that older officers recognized immediately. Once, while I was packing to leave base for the holidays, my phone rang, and an older voice said, "Mom," without hesitation, asking for confirmation on a logistics decision that had stalled. I gave it, closed the loop, and ended the call before anyone else could hear. When I stepped into Mark House that night, I silenced my phone without thinking, a habit formed from years of not letting private channels spill into public spaces. I did not want explanations. I did not want recognition. I wanted boundaries. That was the irony Mark never saw. He thought authority was something you announced. I knew it was something you protected by using it sparingly. The promotions followed quietly, justified by metrics that did not care about personality. Time on target improved. Error rates dropped. Coordination held under stress. I never told my family any of it. I had learned that information given to people who needed to feel superior would be used as leverage. Paige would have turned it into content. Mark would have turned it into a test. Elaine would have turned it into something to avoid discussing. So I kept it contained. Sitting there in cuffs, I felt the familiar split between environments. I was not afraid of confrontation or consequence. I was afraid of the place where none of my tools worked, the table where people wanted me as proof of their righteousness. I could manage risk in complex systems, but I could not manage the hunger some people have to feel justified. I watched Mark posture and Paige film, and thought of how different rules applied in rooms where accountability mattered. I thought of the radio call where Black Angel had been used once and only once, and how everyone involved had understood exactly what to do without asking who I was. I thought of the quiet respect that came from competence rather than performance. Then I thought of Grandma Ruth's message telling me not to react because reaction fed them. I breathed evenly and waited. I was not afraid of the battlefield. I was afraid of the dinner table where people wanted me to be evidence for their certainty. By the time the cuffs bit into my skin, I already understood how Mark had arranged this, because he was not careless, and he was not stupid. He was deliberate in the way men who crave control often are. He did not call uniformed police with sirens and flashing lights. That would have drawn questions. Instead, he used a contact he had bragged about for years, someone he described as a base connection, a name he dropped whenever he wanted to feel important. Earlier that week, he had told Elaine that I was unstable, that my attitude had changed, that military service had gone to my head. He said I had threatened him, that I had claimed authority I did not have, that I had implied access to resources that frightened him. He framed it as concern the way he always did. I am worried about her, he said. I think she might be impersonating something she is not. He printed documents that looked official at a glance, forms with headers and stamps copied from public templates lines, highlighted where he had typed accusations that could not be verified. He practiced the story aloud, repeating it until it sounded reasonable even to himself. When the liaison arrived, Mark greeted him like a host, welcoming a guest, shaking hands, firmly speaking in a low, measured voice. He gestured toward me as if I were already a problem solved. "She is being detained for everyone's safety," he said. "Temporary custody. Procedure." The words were vague on purpose. As the cuffs were tightened, Mark leaned close and pulled them just a bit tighter than necessary. "Remember whose house this is?" he whispered. Paige circled slowly, phone raised her voice light and mocking. "Tell them your rank, come on. If you are so important, say it out loud." Mark straightened and smiled at the table. "If you are so important, why will not you say it out loud?" Elaine stared at her plate as if the pattern on it required her full attention. Grandma Ruth looked like she might stand, then sank back into her chair, hands clenched together. No one stopped eating. Forks scraped against plates. Someone passed the gravy. That was the dirtiest part, the way normalcy was weaponized, how my humiliation was folded into tradition. I felt the cuffs tighten again as Mark adjusted them, testing how much pain he could cause without drawing comment. "This will remind you to stay humble," he said softly. Paige laughed and zoomed her camera. Inside, my pulse slowed. The noise of the room faded into assessment. I did not need to guess whether what he was doing was wrong. I could see the gaps clearly. The liaison avoided my eyes because he knew something was off. There was no clear authorizing officer, no jurisdiction properly established, no incident number logged. Mark kept talking, filling the space with certainty, hoping volume would substitute for validity. I did not challenge him with speeches. I asked two questions evenly, the way I always did when something was misrouted. Who is the authorizing officer? The room stilled for half a second. Mark blinked, then waved a hand. "We can get that later," he said. I asked again, quieter. "Where is the incident number logged?" The liaison shifted his weight. Paige scoffed and said, "Do not play games." Mark's jaw tightened. He did not answer because he could not. He leaned in again and tightened the cuffs once more harder. This time, a small punishment meant to remind me he still believed he was in control. If you are angry for Nix right now, drop one like. The more likes this story gets, the more likely it reaches the people who need to see it. The knock at the door cut through the room with a firmness that did not ask permission, and the sound changed everything. The liaison straightened before anyone else did. Footsteps followed, measured and controlled, and then the door opened to reveal CPT Owen Kessler with First Sergeant Torres just behind him. Kessler paused at the threshold, taking in the scene the way officers do when something feels wrong before they know why. A dining table half cleared, plates still warm. A young woman cuffed in her own family home. A phone raised and recording. He frowned not in anger but in professional discomfort and asked a simple question. "What is going on here?" Mark stepped forward eagerly, relief lighting his face. "Captain, I did the right thing," he said. "She was making threats, claiming authority she does not have. I acted to protect my family." Kessler did not respond immediately. He glanced at the paperwork Mark offered, flipping through the pages with a practiced eye. His phone vibrated once. He checked it out of habit, then again more carefully. The room seemed to hold its breath. On the screen was a brief system message, the kind that does not come often and is never ignored. Priority handling. Confirm identity. Black Angel Protocol. Kessler's posture changed instantly, shoulders squared, voice lowered. He looked up from the phone and fixed his gaze on Mark. "Where did you get this name?" Mark blinked, confused. "What name?" Kessler did not answer him. He turned slowly toward me, eyes searching my face for confirmation rather than challenge. Black Angel. He said it quietly as a question, as a recognition. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Torres straightened fully boots, aligning without a word, and addressed me softly. "Mom?" The sound of that single word landed heavier than any accusation. Forks stopped moving. Paige's phone dipped slightly before she caught herself. Elaine looked up, startled as if waking from a trance. Kessler stepped closer and spoke with calm authority. "Remove the restraints. Now." Mark stepped in front of him instinctively. "You cannot." Kessler cut him off without raising his voice. "You already did what you cannot." The cuffs came off. Blood rushed back into my wrists in a sharp sting. I rubbed them once, slowly grounding myself, then looked past Mark to Grandma Ruth, whose eyes were wet with a mixture of fear and relief. I gave her a small nod. I did not look at Mark. There was nothing left to say to him. Kessler addressed the room, his tone professional and final. "This situation is above my pay grade, because it was never yours." He glanced at Torres, then back at me. "We will take it from here." Paige's hand shook as she lowered her phone. The room was silent, stunned by the realization that the story Mark had built was collapsing under the weight of proper channels and protocols. Kessler turned back to Mark once more. "You do not get to invent authority. You do not get to detain someone because it makes you feel important." Mark's mouth opened, then closed. No one spoke for him. The dinner table that had been a stage for humiliation moments before now felt like a courtroom after a verdict. I stood quietly, pain still echoing in my wrists, and waited, knowing this was only the beginning of the reckoning, but also knowing that for the first time in that house the system had spoken louder than he ever could. The room did not erupt when the door opened again. It compressed as if air itself had been pressed flat. Special Agent Rollins stepped inside in plain clothes, calm and unhurried, carrying no visible authority except the kind that does not need to announce itself. He scanned the table once and spoke in a voice that was neutral to the point of unsettling. Phones on the table. No recording. Paige froze, eyes wide, then slowly placed her phone face down as if it might burn her. Rollins waited until every screen was still before continuing. "Who initiated custody?" No one answered. Mark cleared his throat and began to speak, but Rollins raised a hand without looking at him. One at a time. He turned to the liaison first. The liaison answered quietly, eyes down, explaining who had made the call and what had been claimed. Rollins nodded and began moving through the situation like a checklist, not angry, not impressed, just thorough. He confirmed that the call had gone through the wrong channel, that no proper authorizing officer had been assigned, that there was no valid jurisdiction established for detainment in a private residence. He asked for the incident number. There was none. He asked where it had been logged. It had not been. Each answer landed heavier than the last, not because of volume, but because of certainty. Rollins then turned his attention to Paige's phone. "You recorded an alleged crime and published commentary," he said evenly. "That creates a defamation risk when the underlying accusation is unsupported." Paige's hands began to shake. Mark tried to interrupt, insisting he had acted out of concern that respect for the military required decisive action. Rollins finally looked at him fully, eyes steady. "You do not get to invoke military respect to override due process. That attempt creates additional exposure, not protection." He turned slightly, making sure everyone could hear. "Her record is sealed. You do not get to demand what you are not cleared to know." The words settled over the table like a lid closing. For the first time I saw understanding flicker across my family faces. Not admiration, not fear, recognition. The silence that followed was different from the one before. This one was heavy with consequence. Mark tried again, softer now, asking for the chance to explain his side, to clarify intent. Rollins did not let him finish. "Not your narrative anymore." Paige stared at her phone, as if calculating damage she could not control. Elaine finally spoke, voice thin and pleading. "Mark, stop." It came too late. Rollins continued, calmly outlining next steps without drama. Statements would be taken. The improper detainment would be reviewed. The recording would be preserved as evidence, not entertainment. Mark's posture collapsed inch by inch as the authority he had borrowed evaporated. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The system had reset the room. I stood quietly, wrists still aching, watching the roles invert without celebration. This was not triumph. It was correction. Comment, reset. If you appreciate justice that locks in quietly without noise, the consequences did not arrive with sirens or handcuffs, and that was exactly what made them real. In the days that followed Christmas Eve, the house emptied of noise and filled with process. Statements were taken separately, timelines were reconstructed. The liaison was placed on temporary suspension pending internal review. Mark was instructed through formal channels to cease all contact with me until further notice. The language was precise, clinical, impossible to argue with. A protective order followed, limited but firm, not dramatic enough to satisfy pride, yet strong enough to end his reach. Paige learned quickly that what she had filmed could not be erased, only reframed, and reframing was no longer in her control. Elaine withdrew into herself, answering calls with short replies, telling relatives she needed time. The community shifted almost overnight. Neighbors who once deferred to Mark stopped returning his calls. The church group he chaired reassigned responsibilities quietly. The homeowners' association meetings continued without him, his opinions noted, and then passed over. Power did not explode when it left him. It simply stopped answering. I returned to base and resumed my duties with the same restraint I always had. There were no celebrations, no comments. Just work steady and unremarkable on the surface. Weeks later, I saw him again by accident in the parking lot of a grocery store near the base. He looked smaller, somehow less certain. He approached me without greeting, eyes scanning for witnesses. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "This has gone too far. You know people. You can fix this." He did not apologize. He did not ask how I was. He asked for access. I told him calmly, "I do not weaponize my rank to clean up your ego." His face hardened. "Family owes family," he said. I met his gaze and answered just as quietly. "Family does not arrest you for applause." He had no reply. If you choose boundaries over blood, comment boundaries. The quiet came later, after the paperwork, after the calls stopped, after the tension drained from places I did not know had been holding it. I took Grandma Ruth to lunch on a weekday when the restaurant was nearly empty, the kind with simple menus and familiar faces. She moved slowly, but insisted on paying for her own tea. We did not talk about Christmas. We did not talk about Mark or Paige or what the neighbors might be saying now. I asked her one question and meant it fully. "Are you okay?" She nodded, eyes soft, and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. That was enough. Healing did not need narration. A few days later, my phone lit up with a message from Elaine. It was short and careful, the way people write when they want to acknowledge something without standing inside it. "I hope you are safe. I hope you find peace." I read it twice and did not respond. Not because I was angry, but because some messages are bridges the sender must finish building alone. Work resumed the way it always did, without ceremony. Back on base, the conference room lights hummed quietly. Screens glowed with maps and timelines. Checklists waited to be cleared. I took my seat, reviewed the brief, noted the risks, adjusted one sequence that would tighten coordination. No one asked me how I felt. They did not need to. When the room settled, a voice from the far end spoke with calm respect. "Mom, we are ready for your decision." There was no title attached, no explanation offered, just protocol, clean and sufficient. I nodded once and gave it. The work moved forward. Later, walking out into the evening air, I thought about the difference between noise and resolution. Revenge had never been about destroying them. It was about returning what they tried to hand me: shame, guilt, a false story, and leaving it where it belonged. If you want me to continue this military justice series, please subscribe and comment your state.